One of the questions that we begin to ask as we get deeper and deeper into multicultural marketing is why multicultural? Why is this something that brands need to pay attention to? Why do companies need to develop a whole different campaign, a whole new approach to dealing with a specific market segment? The core of multicultural marketing, as the name suggests, is culture. We believe that there are sufficient, significant cultural differences that make certain groups distinct, unique. And so the strategy that we are using to target one group may not necessarily be effective in targeting another group. So, what is culture? When I was growing up, I learned a really, really simple definition of culture, and it was, quite simply put, the way of life of a people. And I like that definition very well because it is simple. But Mueller does discuss in chapter 3 a more nuanced definition of culture. Well, some of the things that I want us to kind of remember about culture, some of the key features then of culture is that one, culture is learned. This is something that you were born into a particular group, and then through over your lifetime, you learn these lessons through these institutions, through church, through school, through your family, friends, your community. You basically learn your culture, right? So a culture is something that is taught, passed down. It's absorbed over time. Another thing about culture is that culture is shared. So culture is normally something that, like we said, you learn from somebody else, which means somebody else knew the rules and they passed it on to you. And so when you are a part of a culture, your understanding of the rules is not unique to you. Somebody else will see it that exact same way, meaning they also understand the rules to be that way, right? And so culture tends to be shared. Multiple people, large enough groups of people also have those similar values. They also see things in that similar light. And so culture is shared. And of course, culture is interrelated. And so the symbols, the rituals, the values, they are all connected, and they do speak to those core tenets of a particular culture. And so they are interrelated. Nothing is in isolation. And so when we see, for example, the aspects of, they call them the objective aspects of culture. So the buildings, the food, the things that we can see, touch, feel, taste, hear, those are the objective aspects of a culture. But there are deeper meanings, right? Values. So people do certain things, the rituals, the things that we do over and over again, that there are reasons behind those things. And so that's why we say that culture is interrelated. Of course, culture is made up of, as we said, values, which are basically rules that kind of teach us what is right, what is wrong, what is acceptable, what is not acceptable in a culture. We also have rituals. So when we think about it, there are certain ways of doing things that are connected to certain cultures and cultural values. And so we see, for example, certain rituals like baptisms, weddings. Those are very culturally bound, and we know that. I don't know if you've ever watched Four Weddings on TLC, but whenever you watch TLC, you will realize that if they were to do, for example, an Orthodox Greek wedding, if they were to do an American wedding, an African American wedding, an Italian wedding, it would be four completely different weddings. There are certain things that are common, but in many instances, there are differences as well, right? We also have our heroes. Almost every culture has have people who are looked up on as pretty much the epitome of the values. Those persons have lived the values. They have done so much to advance a country and culture, and they become kind of bastions that people look to as great examples of what that ideal person from your culture is supposed to be like. And of course, we have the symbols, and we know that we see those symbols out in society, and they mean different things to different people. And so there are certain symbols that are very culturally bound and very specific. And when we see them, we associate them with a particular culture. And within cultures, these symbols mean very, very deep things to those members, right? And so when we think of culture, we have to think about all of those things. And like we said, we just want to get to that point where we understand that there are objective aspects of culture. Those are the things we see, the architecture, all of those things. But it takes a lot more study, a lot more research to really understand the subjective aspect of the culture, the emotional part of it, the history, those values that are attached to certain things, right? If we picture, for example, an iceberg, really what we see, the tip of the iceberg, is really the objective aspect of the culture. The subjective aspect of the culture is that huge mass that exists beneath the surface that it takes a lot of time and effort to really get to, if we ever fully understand what is under there, right? Okay, so in discussing culture, we will hear the word subculture mentioned a lot. In this course, we use the word co-culture because when we think of subcultures, we think of cultures within a culture that are probably not as important or less than. And so we feel as if this subculture is subservient to that mainstream culture, as you would say. Well, in multicultural marketing, we encourage persons to think of cultures as our co-cultures. They're equally important, equally valuable to the individual and to society. And so, and we coexist. These cultures are coexisting within the US, right? And so when we discuss co-cultures, that is how I want us to consider it, not subcultures, but co-cultures instead, right? One of the things why this is important when we consider co-cultures versus subcultures. Mueller discusses self-reference criterion and ethnocentrism, because when we consider other cultural groups, one of the mistakes that we make as marketers is that we assume that the way that we see things, our cultural perspective, is the same as somebody else's, meaning another culture's, when that is not necessarily the case. And that is one of the issues. We have to learn more about other cultures to understand that our culture does not determine, or perspective is very culturally bound. We see things through cultural lens that are basically based on our experiences and our culture. However, that does not necessarily mean that another group's cultural lens is exactly the same. And that's one of the main assumptions that we try to get rid of in multicultural marketing, that our cultural lens is the same as another group's, right? And so when we get away from using the self-reference criterion, we are better able to seek out and understand the differences. The other construct that we discuss is ethnocentrism, which is that belief that your culture is superior or better than another culture. And so in many instances, we have seen, if we watch movies where we see that, persons are called savages, they are not developed, and we see that because in our mind, development and the right way of doing things is the way that we learned in our culture. And so when we see something different, we think, oh, you're not doing it the right way. My way is the right way. The way we do it in my culture is the right way. And that's another thing that a lot of marketers fall prey to. And that is something that we cannot afford to have happen in multicultural marketing. We have to understand that cultures are different but equally valuable, and because somebody's way of doing things is different, that doesn't make it less right than your way. Okay? Of course, we know that culture affects communication, right? Because language is one of those big things that we talk about all the time, that, a lot of terms are culturally bound. And language is culturally bound, right? And so in many instances, language and culture are so tied together that you can't really separate them, right? But one of the things that we know is that communication is both verbal and nonverbal. And so in some cultures, you have high context cultures. And in high context cultures, the contextual cues represent most of the communication, not necessarily what is said. So Asian cultures are considered to be high context cultures. And then we also have low context cultures, where a lot of the meaning is transferred via words, what is said, what is written. And so we consider US culture to be a low context culture. We consider non-Hispanic whites to be from a low context culture. So non-Hispanic whites versus Asian Americans, we're talking about high context versus low context cultures here, right? Of course, as I was saying about language, one of the big things that we will hear in multicultural marketing is what language should we communicate to, for example, Hispanic customers in. And in many instances, we have always in the past thought of multicultural marketing or Hispanic specific marketing as, oh, let me just put this ad into Spanish and it is great because all Hispanics understand Spanish. That is not the case. One of the things we stress in this course is not only in language, but in culture advertising. One of the things that we have to understand is that when we try to just target Hispanics or any group in just native language, what we are doing is we are basically alienating those persons who, one, are not necessarily watching as much ethnic specific media, but they also watch mainstream media, so they won't see themselves there if we're just going to focus all our efforts on putting Spanish language advertising or ethnic specific advertising on ethnic specific media. They are not a part of mainstream. And the next thing that's going to happen is that persons who are, whether they're English dominant or they're bilingual, they are looking for content in both languages. They're looking to see themselves, they're looking to be communicated with on not just ethnic specific media, but mainstream as well. And so we severely limit ourselves by doing that. That is not just the case for Hispanics, but Asian Americans as well. What we learn about Asian Americans is that they're the fastest growing immigrant group, and the vast majority of Asian Americans, I think it's over 70%, were born outside the U.S. So they speak another language at home, but the Asian American consumer is also extremely diverse. So when we think about Asia, we are not only talking about China, we are not only talking about Taiwan, we are talking about Japan, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia. The list goes on. There is so much diversity in the Asian American market, and that has to be taken into consideration as well. One of the things that we understand is that if we are going to be able to do ethnic specific advertising, especially when we're looking at the more diverse groups like Asian American consumers, more segmentation needs to occur within that group before we can connect with them. Of course, African Americans, yes, they speak English, but advertisers also know that Ebonics is a thing because African Americans do have different dialects that they use to communicate with each other. However, it can be quite problematic for brands who try to use Ebonics to communicate with African American consumers. It is one of those minefields that one has to be quite careful to step into. And I suggest that you take a look at Mueller to see, some more information, and you can look around in media. You will see, because it has to be organic, it has to be clean, and it has to be respectful, because you don't want to be perpetuating negative stereotypes in commercials, right? And you don't want to seem fake as well. And that is one of the big things about multicultural marketing, language in marketing. And so, as I said before, language is a huge issue. However, in culture is extremely important, if not even more important than in language. Okay? Of course, when we talk about language, translations become one of those topics that gets discussed because, of course, poor translations can make or break your campaign. And we have seen, not just in international marketing, but in multicultural marketing, where certain campaigns, when you rely on direct translations, meaning you take those English words and you translate them directly to another language, they may not necessarily mean the same thing, right? And so direct translations sometimes don't work and create huge problems and actually communicate opposite messages that are insulting, messaging that don't make any sense to the consumer. And so in translation, we recommend back translation. So we translate from English to the other language, back from the other language to English, to make sure that it actually makes sense, right? And so you want to not just use a software, not just use one single expert, because again, dialect is different. For example, among Hispanics, the Mexican dialect is going to be different than the Puerto Rican dialect, is going to be different than the Cuban dialect. It's the exact same thing with, of course, when we talk about Asian Americans, we're talking about multiple languages. We're not even talking about how different dialects and they're just words that are different, but generally people have an idea. We have just completely different languages also that we have to take into consideration. We do have nonverbal aspects of culture. So, for example, eye contact. For example, Asian cultures, staring people down, looking at them, protracted eye contact, lengthy eye contact is considered disrespectful, while in other cultures, you're expected to be direct. You're expected to look people in the eye, and people will think that you are dishonest or you don't have any confidence if you don't look them in the face. So that is something that we have to take into consideration. Also, use of space, right? We know that non-Hispanic whites tend to prefer a lot more space between individuals, whereas in, for example, Hispanic cultures and African American cultures, people tend to that whole intimate distance and social distance is used a lot more, and people come a lot closer. They touch you more. Hugs are more happen more frequently, and in certain cultures, people will kiss your face as a greeting, or kisses are a part of greetings in certain cultures, and so that is something that we also take into consideration. One of the things that we know as well is that colors mean different things in other cultures. So, for example, let's go back to that say yes to the dress example. There was an Indian bride who was getting married, and in her appointment, she wanted to find a dress that could be dyed red, because in their culture, that was something that was important. Because I think in that culture, white is actually worn at funerals, not at a wedding as we would see, right? And so that is something that we have to take into consideration. That is important for example, colors that are used not just on clothing, but also in ads, right? And at different holidays. So we know that we have to basically take the time to understand those color associations based on different cultures. Of course, we know that religion and religious practices do influence the cultures and the values, ethics, and ethical standards and morals, right? We know that, for example, Hispanics are majority Catholic. We also know that, for example, African Americans, church is a huge part of their culture, and in many instances, it's going to affect their views on many things. So, for example, marriage and divorce, abortion, birth control, a lot of those topics are very culturally bound. We also know that that influences person's perception of right and wrong, what is the right way, what's the most ethical thing to do, and so based on the histories of these groups, not just Hispanics, but also African Americans, these cultures, church was a seminal part of African American history, the civil rights movement, the progress of that particular ethnic group. And so, and some companies have been able to use that as a means of connecting with people. However, I would say that, again, it requires a lot of care and caution. It requires a lot of research, because you want to be organic in your approach. You don't want to seem fake. You do not want to appear as if you are taking advantage of a particular multicultural audience, and that is extremely important. The last thing that I would, the last aspect of culture that I would discuss is family. Family is, as it plays a seminal role in most minority cultures. How persons relate to family, the size of families, having extended family, non-traditional households that have extended family members as part of them, that is very heavily influenced. The roles, masculine roles versus feminine roles, the role of the mother, the role of the father, those are very culturally bound as well. And as you delve into Mueller, you will see a lot of that information, and you really have to understand that, because, for example, I remember reading about the Got Milk campaign, how they had originally had an idea of saying, the child goes to the refrigerator and there is no milk. The mom has run out of milk. Whereas while this does not necessarily mean the exact same thing in a non-Hispanic white culture, in the Hispanic culture, it is actually extremely insulting to imply that a mom cannot take care of her family. That is extremely important, and so and that is the Marianismo, which is an aspect of Hispanic culture, which is that role of the mom as a nurturer, the caregiver, that would have been, something that you can't really imply in, for example, an ad that is targeted to Hispanics. And so, again, as I said, a lot of these things are very culturally defined, culturally bound, and so we want to pay very close attention to those differences, because what will work in one cultural group will not work in another group. And this is, as I said, we're just talking about the U.S. Yes, this happens as well in international marketing examples, but those examples are also here when we consider the multicultural consumer. One of the last things that Mueller talks about is the cultural dimensions that are developed by Gerd Hofstede. The dimension that is mentioned here in the book is individualism versus collectivism, which is that importance of community and family as opposed to individual goals. And so you will see that certain cultures are very highly individualistic, while other cultures, like non-Hispanic whites, are considered to be highly individualistic, while most minority cultures, so Hispanics, African Americans, and even Asian Americans, are highly collectivistic. The family unit is extremely important. Community is also extremely important, and conforming with those values that are a part of those communities are very heavily stressed. What does this mean in terms of how does it apply to marketing? What I hope we see, as we have been discussing, is that culture will affect why people buy, right? Motivation. Culture affects motivation. And so it will affect why we purchase. And so if we want to make a connection with a multicultural consumer, we have to figure out why they buy, because that's the only way we're going to motivate them to patronize our brands. Then there's the how they buy. Buying patterns are different. The places people buy and how people buy, in terms of, making large purchases, in terms of and if you review some of the Nielsen reports that are currently in the course library, you will see that, for example, certain groups are more likely to make one huge trip that is going to expend a lot of money all at once. Meanwhile, others will make multiple smaller trips. So again, how people purchase is very heavily influenced as well. What people purchase clearly is, of course, certain groups, they have unique tastes that will influence what they buy. Yes, they consume a lot of the fast-moving consumer goods that we do, but there are also other products that are consumed as well. We also, where they buy is heavily influenced as well. In the previous chapter, we have talked about product, price, place, promotion. We did discuss place and so we have to take into consideration that people will purchase in places that they are more comfortable. For example, the African American consumer, where service is available in their language. For example, the Hispanic or the Asian American consumer, where that shopping experience is will meet their requirements. Also, who makes purchase decisions? When we look at the role of family, we look at also, gender roles. We look at the household income. We look at family structure. We look at the earning of different members of a family or different members of an ethnic group. We begin to see how certain persons make purchases while other persons influence the purchases. Who has the buying power? Who makes those purchase decisions? How important is, for example, the child in the decision-making process? How important is the husband in the decision-making process? What decisions do the women make as opposed to the men? All of those things are things that we have to consider. We also will see that the role of money changes based on groups. So I will use this one quick example. Certain groups live to work, meaning work is important. Advancing in your profession, getting to that pinnacle of your professional career, that is super important in some groups, while other persons work to live, meaning I work so that I can afford the finer things in life. I can afford to spend time with my family. I can afford to do these things. So this is just a broad overview of some of the things that you will encounter in your reading of Mueller Chapter 3. I encourage you guys to not just watch this video, but also go ahead and go back and pay some really close attention to the readings, because I just give a broad overview of the content, but I would hope that you are going to get into your readings and really kind of get a deeper understanding. I just realized that I skipped something, and I wanted to talk about it really quickly. The difference between acculturation and assimilation. Mueller defines assimilation as the act of making or becoming like something else. And I want us to understand what that means, because that can be taken to mean so many things, and I want us to pretty much be on the same page. When we talk about assimilation, the act of making or becoming like something else, what we're talking about is the complete replacement of the home country culture with the host country culture. And I discussed this in the week 1 video. Meanwhile, the acculturation is the adoption of an alien culture. And so what you do is you take on certain elements of an alien culture, but home country culture, your deeply held cultural beliefs remain unmoved. They're there still. So let's just recap. Assimilation, you become, or your home country culture is completely replaced by the culture of the country that you have migrated into, the culture that you're now living in. Whereas acculturation, yes, you take on certain cultural values, certain behaviors from the culture that you're currently living in. You're adapting, right? However, home country culture remains. There are, of course, arguments that say that assimilation does not occur. And I am one of those persons who definitely believes that complete assimilation does not occur. Because as we have kind of established earlier, is that we learn our culture over a long period of time. We are raised, and so these things become second nature to us. And so it's very they're deeply rooted. They're very difficult to erode or erase. So meanwhile, somebody can become highly acculturated. It is highly debatable as to whether or not somebody can become fully assimilated, completely erased, because that is something that does not really take place over one person's lifetime. It takes place over many, many generations. And even so, it is difficult to prove that that actually does occur. So yeah, that was the one thing that I forgot to talk about, and I just did. Hopefully you guys actually watch this thing all the way to the very end, because this is one of the questions that I ask on the discussion boards and a lot of people get confused. All right, take care. I'll talk to you guys soon.